Whoa!
Have you ever been sold just because you're a girl? Nalia was. Her wedding felt more like a funeral. Her father forced her to marry Kato, a man so poor and silent the village called him the voiceless ghost. And in that moment, Nalia believed her life was over. But the truth no one saw coming was this. Kato wasn't just a quiet man with nothing to his name. Hidden in an old broken chest, Nalia found a name tag, Dokun Adeyemi, along with elegant photos, letters, and the business card of a billionaire. She had been married to a man who once ruled the city and chose to disappear. This isn't fiction. It's a reflection of many untold stories from rural Africa, where women are still treated as property, and where some men, like Kato, walk away from power to search for love that can't be bought. By the end of this story, you'll see how a girl sold into despair rose to become the queen of her own life. Why a billionaire gave up his fortune to find something money could never buy. And what made an entire village, once cruel and mocking, bow their heads in silence, building wells, schools, and hope, led by the very woman they once despised. Nalia, once broken, once voiceless, now returns with hands covered in soil and eyes full of light. She leaves behind a single bag of rice at her father's door, a silent act of forgiveness, more powerful than any words. Don't scroll past this video, because if you've ever felt small, discarded, or unloved, Nalia's story will remind you of the unstoppable strength buried deep within you. All it takes is 5 minutes. The drums sounded not like celebration, but like a warning. Their hollow thud carried through the dust-choked air, each strike slow, deliberate, as though the earth itself were counting down to something final. Smoke from the incense coils clung low, curling around ankles, staining the air with the acrid tang of burnt resin. The villagers gathered in silence, not with songs or flowers, but with the same hush reserved for a burial. At the center of it all sat Nalia, motionless. A thin veil draped over her head trembled against her breath. Her hands were folded in her lap, but her fingers betrayed her, clenching and unclenching, restless, like birds trapped in a cage. Beneath the gauze of fabric, her eyes stayed wide, refusing to blink. Fixed on the ground as though it might open beneath her, her father, Bakari, loomed beside her, his expression hard and unreadable. Sweat slicked his brow, but his grip on the pen was steady as he leaned toward the parchment on the wooden table, set before the elder. The paper bore only a handful of lines, but its weight was crushing. Each stroke of ink carried away another ounce of his daughter's freedom. The villagers craned their necks, whispering. A man was trading his child for the vanishing of debt. The elder cleared his throat, his voice gravelly from age and smoke. With this mark, the debt is gone. With this union, balance is restored. Bakari pressed the pen down. The scratch of the nib cut through the silence sharper than any cry. And then, from the shadows at the far edge of the crowd, he appeared. Kato, the groom. His tunic was unwashed, stiff with soil and sweat, his sandals fraying at the edges. His shoulders slumped forward, his eyes lowered. Not a word left his mouth as he walked the narrow aisle between the onlookers. Some villagers coughed into their fists to hide their laughter. Others did not bother. A husband born from debt, one muttered. Better call this a funeral than a wedding. Another chuckled. Nalia heard them all, though no one spoke directly to her. The air tightened around her, pressing on her chest until she could hardly breathe. The scent of incense grew sickly sweet, as if it wished to choke her. She lifted her head slightly through the thin veil and caught her first glimpse of the man. His jaw was tight, his gaze hidden beneath his lashes, but his silence was louder than the mockery around him. He carried himself as though he were already condemned, as though this day belonged to death, not life. The drums beat again, slow, final. The elder gestured for Nalia to rise. Her knees trembled beneath her gown, the fabric coarse and heavy against her skin. She stepped forward, led more by duty than by will, until she stood before Kato. The veil was still between them, a gauze curtain that made him seem distant, unreal, like a figure from a nightmare. The elder's hands reached forward. He pinched the veil at its edge and began to lift. The world blurred for a heartbeat, the crowd holding its breath, and then the fabric slipped away. Light touched her face, exposing her bare skin to the eyes of the village. In that moment, Nalia broke. A sob tore from her throat, raw and unrestrained. Not the sound of a bride stepping into joy, but the sound of someone forced into a grave. The elder faltered, his hands trembling. The villagers gasped, some covering their mouths, some smirking at the spectacle. Bakari stiffened, jaw clenched, pretending not to hear the sound of his daughter's despair. Nalia's tears spilled, tracing down her cheeks, warm trails against her skin. They dampened the collar of her dress. Her body shook with each breath, her chest rising too fast, too shallow. Kato stood still beside her. He did not reach out. He did not comfort. He only let his eyes rise for the first time, and in them flickered something unexpected. Not cruelty, not indifference, but a shadow of sorrow. For the briefest instant, she thought she saw recognition, as if he too were bound by chains invisible to everyone else. The ceremony moved on regardless. Words were spoken, blessings recited in monotone, the elder's voice echoing hollowly across the square. The paper was folded, sealed with a smear of wax. The drums kept beating, steady, merciless, like a heart that refused to stop. The villagers leaned into each other, their voices a tide of gossip. She weeps as though she's walking into her tomb. Cursed child, cursed union. No one laughed anymore. Their amusement had curdled into unease. Nalia stood in the center of it all, veil abandoned at her feet, her tears glinting like shards of glass in the dim light. Every breath hurt, every sound pressed against her skull. She felt the weight of soil, though none had been thrown on her yet, and when the last word was spoken, when the elder's hands lowered in dismissal, silence fell heavier than the drums. The crowd began to disperse, their sandals scraping against the dirt, leaving whispers like smoke trails behind them. Bakari signed the final line, folded the parchment into his sleeve, and did not look at his daughter. Kato shifted his weight, but still said nothing. He stood at her side, an unmoving figure silent as a grave marker. The incense burned lower, the coils collapsing into ash. The air thinned. Nalia closed her eyes, and for a moment she imagined she was no longer standing in a square, but sinking into the earth, covered by soil, her cries muffled in the dark. The sound of the last drum faded. The hush that followed was worse, and there, in that emptiness, her heart cracked open with a question that no blessing could answer. Had her life just begun, or had it already ended? The night did not welcome her. The walls of the hut leaned close, shadows pooling in every corner, the thatched roof whispering with the faint stir of wind outside. Nalia sat on the narrow bamboo bed, her hands pressed flat against her lap, her body stiff as though bracing for an unseen blow. She could hear the village fading into silence beyond the mud walls, dogs barking far away, the last voices of neighbors muttering, then nothing but the crackle of a half-dead fire. Her chest rose and fell in shallow bursts. Every sound scraped her nerves, the scrape of wood, the shuffle of feet, the whisper of cloth. She imagined rough hands, the weight of a stranger pressing down. The humiliation that everyone had warned her was her fate. Her eyes darted to the door. A strip of pale moonlight seeped through its edges. The air carried the smell of ash and damp earth. Then came the sound. Kato entering. He moved without haste, his sandals dragging a little, the faint clink of a metal cup in his hand. He did not look at her. He crossed the hut, his shadow sliding over the walls like an omen. Nalia's heart pounded so loud she thought it might betray her fear. She gripped the edge of the bed until her nails bit into the wood. But what he did next froze her more than if he had lunged. He reached for an old mat, thin, frayed, smelling of mildew, and spread it across the packed dirt floor. No words, no glance. He lowered himself down, his back turned to her, and lay still. His breathing slowed into a steady rhythm, untroubled, as though she were not there at all. Her breath caught. She stared at the curve of his shoulders, at his silence. It was not the violence she had feared, but something stranger. A refusal, a wall of distance built higher than any cruelty. She turned her face away, ashamed of the relief that mingled with her confusion. The nights that followed were the same. She waited in silence, braced for the moment he might change, but he never did. The mat always on the floor, his back always to her, his mouth always closed. Day after day she watched him in the dim morning light. He rose before the village stirred, leaving without a word, returning only with bundles of firewood or with calloused hands stained from work. When she offered a timid greeting, he only nodded. If she asked something, his head dipped or shook. His lips stayed sealed. The villagers noticed. They whispered louder now, bold in their mockery. The mute and his purchased bride. A woman bought for silence. Children laughed as they repeated it, cruel in their innocence. The words clung to Nalia like burrs, tearing at her skin each time she walked through the market. She lowered her eyes, clutching her basket closer, her cheeks burning. She thought she hated him for it, for giving them the weapon to wound her. Yet inside their hut, it was different. She began to see small gestures in the quiet. A bowl of rice placed closer to her side of the table. A piece of fish left untouched until she had taken her share. A jar of water refilled without her asking. His eyes, when they briefly met hers, carried no judgment, only the faintest trace of something unspoken. She tried to ignore it, but the moment stayed with her. One evening, when she thought he had gone to gather more wood, she searched the hut for something to occupy her restless hands. In the far corner, beneath layers of dust and cobwebs, her fingers brushed against a small object. She pulled it into the light, a ring, silver dulled with time, its surface scratched and worn. Inside, faint letters carved into the band, a single initial, A. The mark was almost gone, but still there, stubborn as a ghost. She turned it over and over in her palm. The metal was cold, biting her skin. Whose name had it once carried? Why had he kept it when he kept nothing else of value? She closed her fist around it quickly, startled by the creak of the door. Kato entered, his arms heavy with logs. His eyes flicked to her hand, then to her face. For an instant, she thought he knew, thought he might break his silence. but he only looked down, dropped the wood beside the hearth, and set to arranging it. She slipped the ring into her pocket, her pulse racing. That night, she could not sleep. She lay on her side, watching the faint rise and fall of his back as he slept on the floor. The ring pressed against her thigh where she had hidden it. The letters burned into her thoughts. A name unsaid, a story buried. She wondered if his silence was not emptiness at all, but a weight too heavy to carry into words. Her anger at him softened, though it did not vanish. She felt caught between pity and resentment, her emotions twisted until she could no longer separate one from the other. She wanted to shake him, demand he speak, yet she also wanted to reach out, to understand what shadows haunted him. The moon shifted across the roof, casting pale stripes of light across the hut. The air smelled of smoke and dust. Her throat ached with words she dared not speak. She shut her eyes, holding them tight, but the image of that silver ring returned, shining in the dark like a question that would not let her go. By morning, she rose to the same silence, the same nods, the same gestures, the same distance. Yet now every small kindness he offered her, the way he shifted a bowl closer, the way he carried water farther than needed, was colored by the secret she held. She saw sorrow in him where before she had seen only blankness, and with that sorrow came something dangerous, a flicker of tenderness, too fragile to trust, too strong to ignore. The villagers' voices grew sharper, more cruel. She walked past them, her chin lowered, their words slicing into her back. She cries in the night, but he cannot answer. Even the mute has no need for her. She bit her lip until the taste of iron filled her mouth, but inside she carried a secret heavier than their laughter. The ring pressed against her skin each day, reminding her that her husband was not only silent, but also hiding something that belonged to another life. And in the silence of the hut, between the thud of his steps and the crackle of the fire, she began to wonder, had she been sold to a stranger, or to a man broken by a story too painful to speak? The question gnawed at her. It would not leave. One night, unable to bear it, she turned slightly toward him on the mat. Her voice trembled, but found its way out. "Why do you stay silent?" He did not move, did not answer, but she saw his shoulders stiffen, a ripple in the stillness, as if her words had struck a hidden wound. His breath came harder, though he kept his face turned away. She stared at the back of his head, her heart racing, waiting for something, anything. At last he shifted. Slowly he reached for the bowl of rice he had set aside, pushed it closer to her side of the bed, and lay down again. His silence was an answer, and a plea all at once. Tears welled in her eyes. She understood nothing, and yet in that moment she understood too much. His silence was not emptiness. It was grief. She curled onto her side, the ring clutched tight in her palm, and let her tears slip quietly into the night. The drums from her wedding no longer echoed in her ears. Instead, she heard the rhythm of his breathing, steady, fragile, carrying the weight of two broken lives. And she wondered, as sleep finally pulled her under, if there was room in that silence for her voice, or if she would vanish inside it like a shadow swallowed by the dark. Dust rose as her hands dragged across the rough floorboards, her knuckles scraping against hardened earth where mats had pressed for years. Nalia had set herself the task of sweeping the farthest corner of the hut, though the small home hardly warranted such effort. She needed distraction, something to fight against the storm inside her chest. The broom rattled against a low stack of firewood. Cobwebs snapped and clung to her fingers. A smell of rot and dust crept into her nose, sharp enough to sting her throat. She coughed, covering her mouth, but her eyes caught something beneath the grime. It was a wooden chest, its edges eaten by time. The lock was a crust of rust, brittle, almost decorative now. She froze, heart knocking harder than before. Kato had never mentioned such a chest. He owned so little: a mat, bowls, a faded tunic. This trunk was the only thing that looked like it belonged to a man who once had more than silence to his name. Her fingers hovered. She glanced toward the doorway. Kato was gone, chopping wood by the sound of dull thuds outside. The village was quieter in the heat of the afternoon. She knelt, her palm sweating against the lid, and tugged. The rust cracked, metal flaking, and the lock gave way with a reluctant snap. The lid creaked open, releasing a smell that was not dirt or wood smoke, but paper long hidden from light. Inside lay fragments of another life. A name stared at her from a stiff card, letters printed bold: D. Dokun Adeyemi. She whispered it, tasting the syllables like forbidden fruit. The name felt too large for the hut, too strange to belong to the man who slept on mats and answered her with nods. Beneath it, folded paper. A letter never opened, its edges yellowed, sealed with wax now cracked with age. The name of the sender was written in careful hand: Yinka. The ink had not faded. She turned it over, tempted to break the seal, but her hand trembled. She slid it back beneath the card. There was more. A photograph, its corners bent, but its image sharp. Kato, younger, his face the same yet changed. He stood in the center of well-dressed men, their suits gleaming, their postures proud. Behind them, tall windows revealed a cityscape far removed from the dusty lanes of the village. Kato wore a dark suit, a tie, his eyes direct and steady. Not mute, not bent, someone else entirely. Her throat tightened. She held the photograph closer, her fingertips smudging its surface. Who was he? Which version of him was true? The man silent in shadows, or the one staring bold from this frozen moment? The contrast clawed at her, made her chest ache. The sound of an axe striking wood jolted her. She shoved the items back into the chest, slammed it shut, dragged a cloth over it. Her pulse thundered in her ears. When Kato stepped in later, carrying kindling, his shoulders slick with sweat, she avoided his eyes. He bent to set the wood down, a simple act, but she saw him differently now. Every movement carried the weight of a secret he never spoke. Days stretched long, but the image of the photograph would not leave her. She worked beside him in silence, stealing glances, tracing his face against the memory of the man in the suit. She studied his hands, calloused, scarred, now gripping rough tools. Could these same hands once have written contracts, shaken others in promise? She thought of the ring hidden away, the initial A carved inside, now tangled with this discovery. Each night she lay awake, the trunk's shadow looming larger in her mind. The letter from Yinka haunted her most. Why had he never opened it? Was it guilt or grief? Or had he chosen to bury a name that no longer belonged to him? Her heart warred with itself. Part of her longed to confront him, to demand answers. Another part feared what those answers might be. If he had lived another life, what did that mean for hers? Now chained to his. One evening, as the fire cracked low and the hut filled with smoke, she dared to look at him longer than usual. He sat at the table, mending a broken handle, the faint light catching his profile. His silence felt heavier than the room could hold. She opened her mouth, but the words dried up. She bit them back, swallowing them with the bitterness of ash. Instead, she carried the photograph in her mind. She clung to the letters carved in silver. A. A. The mysteries braided together, forming a rope that pulled tighter around her. When she walked through the village, the laughter of neighbors no longer stung in the same way. Their words, wife of the mute, sold bride, echoed, but her ears carried something louder, the secret hidden in her hut. They thought they knew him. They thought they knew her shame, but they knew nothing. She was the only one who had seen his other face. One night, when the moon hung full and cold, she sat upright while Kato slept on the mat. The letter's seal seemed to glow in her mind's eye, daring her to break it. Her hands shook with the urge. She whispered into the dark, though he could not hear. "Who are you?" Her voice cracked on the last word. He stirred faintly but did not wake. Her chest ached with the weight of not knowing. She pressed her fist against it, forcing herself back down onto the bed. The fire had burned low, the embers glowing red like watchful eyes. She shut her own, but the question refused to close with them. In the stillness, grief swelled. She thought of the veil ripped away at her wedding, her tears mistaken for weakness. Now she wondered if strength might mean facing the truth, even if it shattered what fragile balance they had. The night carried her thoughts to dawn. Light seeped through the cracks of the hut, gold streaks across the floor. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands limp in her lap. The chest waited, silent, its contents alive beneath the wood. She knew she could not pretend forever. Her eyes burned, but she held back tears. She stared at the sleeping form on the mat, his breath steady, his face softened by dreams. For the first time, she feared the answer more than the silence. And yet, as the morning came, as the village stirred awake with its noise and smoke, one truth had already taken root in her heart. The man beside her was not who he seemed. She was bound to him. But bound to what? A stranger, a fugitive from another life, or a broken man trying to bury the weight of his name. The chest had not only given her clues, it had left her with a wound no silence could soothe. She curled forward, gripping her knees, whispering into the empty air. "What else are you hiding from me?" The fire popped softly, throwing sparks against the walls. Outside, the village dogs barked, but inside the question lingered, heavier than wood or ash, a shadow that would not lift. And as the morning brightened, her heart sank with the certainty that the answer, when it came, would change everything. The market square pulsed with heat and noise. Drums of a festival beat in the distance, but here, in the heart of the village, the sound was laughter sharp as stones thrown at glass. Nalia's basket slipped from her hand, spilling cassava roots onto the dust when two women blocked her path. Their eyes glimmered with malice, lips curled into knives. "You carry food for a man who cannot speak," one sneered, her voice loud enough for the crowd to hear. "A wife to the mute. What pride is there in that?" The second joined, crossing her arms, swaying with mock grace. "Even a broom has more use. At least it sweeps." Their laughter erupted, and the crowd fed on it. People turned, pointed, murmured, the circle tightening. Children giggled, mimicking the words. Nalia's face burned. She bent quickly to gather the cassava, but her hand shook. The earth seemed to tilt under her knees. She heard the laughter roll over her like waves, endless, merciless. Her lips quivered with words she could not speak. Her throat clogged with humiliation. She rose, clutching the basket to her chest, her eyes fixed on the ground. But the crowd was merciless, their chorus louder. Sold to a man with no tongue, better to remain unwed. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might split her ribs. Tears brimmed, hot, shameful. She wanted to vanish, to dissolve into dust. And then the laughter cracked apart. Enough! The word tore across the square like thunder. The crowd stilled. A hush swept in, broken only by the bleating of a goat tied to a post. Heads turned. It was him, Kato. He stood on the edge of the circle, shoulders broad, face carved with fire. His voice carried in the open air, strong, undeniable, each syllable echoing like a drum. "She is not a prisoner," he said, stepping forward, his eyes burning into the crowd. "She is not a thing to be bought or sold. She is worth more than every insult spoken here, more than your laughter, more than your envy." The villagers froze, jaws slack. They had not heard his voice since the wedding, and many had begun to believe he had none. His words cracked their certainty, left them gaping. The women who mocked her faltered, glancing at each other, their confidence shriveled. The laughter drained from the square, leaving silence heavy as stone. The village elder stepped forward, his staff striking the earth, his brow furrowed. "Mind your tongue," he warned. "To raise your voice against the people is to defy order." Kato's jaw tightened, but he did not bow. His voice lowered, steady, resolute. "Order is not cruelty. Order is not scorn." The elder's glare deepened, but even he felt the eyes of the crowd shift. A tremor had entered the air, fragile but undeniable. The possibility that the mute was not broken, that the girl was not without defender. Nalia's chest swelled with something unfamiliar. Her tears fell, but not only from shame. She pressed her basket closer, her breath shuddering. She looked at him, at the man who had lain silent night after night, who had carried his grief like a stone in his throat, and now, before them all, let his voice ring out like fire. The crowd broke into whispers. Some scoffed, others nodded slowly, but none could deny what they had witnessed. The man who had been dismissed as nothing had spoken, and his words carried weight. The elder muttered under his breath, his staff thudding as he turned away. "Reckless," he spat, "a troublemaker." The people dispersed, muttering, uneasy. The square emptied, leaving only dust and the echo of what had been said. Nalia stood frozen, her eyes blurred with tears. Kato's gaze met hers for a brief heartbeat, then shifted away. He turned, picked up the cassava that had rolled into the dust, and placed it gently back into her basket. Then, without another word, he walked toward the path home. She could not move. Her body trembled as though the ground beneath her had shaken. Something within her had shifted, a crack in the stone wall she had built around her heart. The laughter of the village still echoed faintly in her ears, but it was muted now, overshadowed by the sound of his voice. The same voice that had been hidden in silence, now unleashed, not to claim her, not to shame her, but to protect her. Her tears fell freely. She wiped them with the back of her hand, but they would not stop. She felt the sting of them, hot against her skin, and in that sting, there was not only pain but also the ache of something breaking open inside her. When she finally walked home, the dust clinging to her feet, her chest ached with every step. The hut came into view, small, humble, but different now. A place not only of silence, but of fire. She entered quietly. He was there, seated by the hearth, feeding kindling into the flames. His eyes lifted once, then dropped again, as though nothing had changed. But she knew better. The air itself hummed with the echo of his words. She set the basket down, her hands trembling. For the first time since her wedding, she felt not like a commodity, not like a shadow, but like someone seen. She lowered herself onto the mat opposite him, her breath shaky, her heart caught between fear and gratitude. Her lips parted, but no words came. Instead, the silence between them grew full, dense, no longer empty, and as the fire crackled, sending sparks into the night, she realized her tears had changed. They were no longer the tears of a woman buried alive, but of a soul touched by the first faint glimmer of hope. The memory of his voice wrapped around her, fragile yet unyielding, and she clutched it close, knowing it would not let her go. But hope was dangerous, and it burned as fiercely as the fire in his eyes. The fever came like a thief in the night. Nalia's body burned, her skin drenched in sweat, her lips cracked, as though the heat inside her wished to turn her into ash. The hut reeked of damp straw and smoke, and every breath rattled in her chest like a broken rattle. She tried to sit up, but her strength betrayed her. Darkness swam before her eyes. She reached weakly toward the clay jar of water, but her arm fell short. Her head throbbed, her throat dry as desert sand. Her voice broke into a whisper no louder than a sigh. No one outside came. The villagers had already turned their backs, just as they had on the day of her wedding. She heard distant laughter, children playing somewhere, but no footsteps dared to approach her door. Through the haze, a shadow moved. A hand touched her forehead, cool cloth pressing against her burning skin. She startled weakly, her eyelids fluttering. Kato knelt beside her, his face tense, his breath shallow with worry. His silence was still there, but it was filled with urgency, filled with care. He dipped the cloth again, wrung it out, and laid it gently across her brow. She tried to speak his name, but her voice cracked. He hushed her, though no word came, only the press of his palm against her shoulder. He rose quickly, fetched water, and tilted it toward her lips. The liquid slid into her mouth, bitter and sweet, the taste of clay and life. That night, he did not sleep. He kept the fire alive with careful hands, stoked it each time it began to fade. He ground herbs into paste, their pungent smell filling the air. He whispered, not realizing the fever carried his voice into her dreams. Amira, the name cut through the haze, sharp and tender. Nalia stirred, her fevered mind clinging to the sound. Amira. It rolled over her like a chant, like grief wrapped in longing. She tried to open her eyes, but they closed again under the weight of fever. She heard him murmur more, his tone breaking, almost a plea. In her dream, she saw the silver ring with the carved letter, gleaming under moonlight. She saw the photograph she had hidden away, the man in the suit who could not be the same as the one watching over her now. And she knew Amira was the ghost he carried, the wound that kept his voice locked away. When dawn broke, pale light seeping through the cracks, she forced her eyes open. The fever had not left, but the world sharpened enough for her to see him slumped at her bedside. His head rested on his folded arms, his body heavy with exhaustion. His hand still gripped hers, fingers clenched as though letting go might tear him apart. Her chest ached at the sight. His face, usually guarded, was unmasked in sleep. Lines of sorrow carved into his brow, lips pressed into a frown even in rest. She studied him, her heart torn between anger at the secrets he hid and a strange, unexpected tenderness for the man who had sat vigil through the night. Her fingers twitched, brushing against his. He stirred, eyes half opening, startled to find her gaze on him. He quickly withdrew his hand, as though ashamed of what she had seen. He rose, busied himself with the herbs, with anything that would draw attention away from his slip. But Nalia could not unsee it. The silence between them was no longer emptiness. It was crowded with grief, with the weight of a woman named Amira, with kindness hidden beneath walls. The villagers' distance grew sharper in the days that followed. She caught whispers when she returned from the well, frail and pale, carrying her jug. Why does he care for her? He did not care for the last one. Cursed, all of them. Their words crawled under her skin, but she held her chin higher. She knew now there was more to him than they understood, more than she understood. One evening, when her fever had broken, she found the silver ring again where she had hidden it. She turned it over, the letter A glinting in firelight. Amira. The name pressed heavy against her chest. She wanted to ask him, to break the silence once and for all. But when she looked at him, at his tired eyes, his hands roughened by gathering herbs, her courage failed. Instead, she held the ring in her palm as she drifted to sleep. She dreamt of a woman she had never met, of laughter lost in smoke, of a love that had turned to ashes. She woke with tears on her cheeks. The next morning, as she bent to fetch water, she faltered. Her knees buckled, and before she could hit the ground, Kato caught her. His arms were strong, steady, holding her upright. For the first time, she let herself lean into him, her head against his chest, her breath catching. His heart beat hard beneath her ear, alive, steady. She felt its rhythm, and for a moment, the silence between them melted into something human, something painfully real. She pulled away quickly, embarrassed, but the memory lingered. His hands had not let her fall. That night, as the fire burned low, she turned toward him, her voice hoarse, but firm. "Who is Amira?" The question sliced through the quiet. His shoulders stiffened. He froze, his eyes fixed on the flames. His lips parted, then closed again. His throat moved, but no words escaped. She waited, her heart hammering, but the silence grew heavier, pressing against her chest until she could hardly breathe. He stood abruptly, threw another log on the fire, sparks flaring. His back stayed to her, his face hidden. The only sound was the crackle of wood. Nalia lay down, her heart twisting. His silence was his confession. She understood then that he carried a wound too deep to speak, a name that lived on his tongue even when he fought to keep it buried. She closed her eyes, but the image of his head bowed at her bedside, his hand clutching hers, would not leave. She held it close, as both comfort and torment. The night stretched long. She did not sleep easily, and when dawn came, she lay awake, staring at the faint light, wondering if she was living beside a man, or a shadow haunted by a love she could never replace. The silver ring burned in her palm, the letter carved like a scar, and in her heart a question took root, sharp and unrelenting. Could two broken lives ever knit together, or would she always be bound to the ghost of a woman who was not her? The engine's roar shattered the village quiet before the sun had fully risen. Children ran to the roadside, dust swirling around their ankles as a gleaming black car rolled through, its polished surface alien against the clay huts. Chickens scattered, a goat bleated in protest, and voices rose in confusion. No one here had ever seen such a machine up close. It hummed like a predator, its windows tinted, its tires biting into the dirt with a growl. Nalia froze where she stood, the morning water jug balanced on her hip. Her heart jolted with dread. She had grown used to whispers, to the heavy weight of secrets inside her hut. But this intrusion, felt like the ground splitting beneath her feet. The car stopped in the center of the square, doors glinting with sunlight. The village gathered quickly, drawn as if by spell. The air buzzed, heavy with unease and curiosity. Then the door opened. A man in a dark suit stepped out. His shoes were too polished for dust, his tie stiff even in the heat. His skin gleamed with city oil, his cologne slicing through the air with a sharp, unfamiliar tang. He surveyed the villagers with the authority of someone who did not need to ask permission to be here. His eyes scanned until they found Kato, or rather the man they called Kato. "Ngai Dokun Adeyemi," he said, his voice carrying with ease, trained in boardrooms and offices far beyond this place. He smiled thinly. At last, the villagers gasped. Their murmurs rippled like fire through dry grass. Nalia's fingers tightened on the jug until she feared it would shatter. Dokun Adeyemi, the name she had whispered to herself in secret, the name printed on the card she had found buried in the chest, now spoken aloud for all to hear. Her eyes flew to her husband. He stood rooted, jaw clenched, shoulders taut. For the first time, he did not look like the silent woodcutter. He looked cornered, exposed. The suited man stepped forward. "I am Yinka, your assistant. I have come to bring you back." The words rang across the square. The villagers' eyes widened. The silence broke into shouts, disbelief, envy. Our mute, a master, a rich man hiding in rags. Their laughter turned into awe, their jeers into praise. Some rushed forward, bowing slightly, their hands outstretched as though ready to serve him. Nalia could not breathe. The man she had been forced to marry, the man who slept on mats, who hid his voice, who whispered another woman's name in the night, was not who he seemed, not broken, not abandoned, but a man of power, of wealth, of a world she could not imagine. Her chest burned with betrayal. She staggered a step back, the water sloshing over her feet. She heard the echo of his first words to the crowd, the day he had defended her. She is not a prisoner. But what did that mean now, when he had imprisoned her in lies? Kato, Dokun, closed his eyes for a heartbeat. When he opened them, his gaze fell on her. It was not the gaze of a stranger, nor of a husband, but of a man caught between two lives. His lips parted, but no words came. The villagers pressed closer, their voices swelling with flattery now. "Forgive us, master. We did not know." They jostled, eager to touch his sleeve, to claim they had always respected him. The same mouths that spat cruelty days before now dripped honey. Nalia's throat tightened. She turned, pushing through the crowd, ignoring the hands that tried to steady her. She did not care where she walked, only that she needed air, needed space, needed to escape the sudden suffocation of truth. Behind her, the man in the suit spoke again. "Your holdings await. The board waits. You cannot linger in shadows forever." His voice cut like a blade, each word confirming what Nalia already knew. The life she had been living was built on a lie. Her footsteps carried her out of the square, into the narrow path lined with dust and thorn bushes. The jug slipped from her hip, crashing to the earth, shattering into shards. Water bled into the soil, vanishing as quickly as her faith. She pressed a trembling hand against her chest, the pain sharp, unbearable. In the distance, the villagers' voices carried still, now chanting his name with reverence. Dokun Adeyemi. Not Kato. Never Kato. She fell to her knees, the broken shards scattered around her, one slicing her palm as she tried to steady herself. She did not notice the blood. She only stared at the water soaking into the dirt, disappearing forever. Her tears blurred the world. She whispered to the wind, her voice raw. "Who are you? Who have I given my heart to?" The wind did not answer. Only the echo of the name spoken in the square lingered, hammering in her skull. The sun rose higher, scorching her skin, but she did not move. She felt hollow, betrayed, yet chained by something she could not name. She thought of the nights he had placed food closer to her, the fever he had tended, the hand that had clutched hers until dawn. Were those lies too? Or was there truth buried beneath the disguise of a man who had hidden from the world? Her palm throbbed, the blood smearing against the shards. She pressed it into the dirt, grounding herself. But the earth swallowed her pain as easily as it had swallowed the spilled water. When at last she rose, her knees shaking, she knew one truth. The life she thought she had was gone. She would have to face the man who stood between two worlds and decide whether his silence had been protection or betrayal. The village cheered in the distance. His name rose like a hymn, but in her chest only silence rang. And in that silence, a question echoed louder than all their voices. Had she lost him the moment she found him, or had she never known him at all? The hut was darker than usual, though the fire glowed bright. Kato, Dokun, was on his knees, his broad shoulders bent low, his forehead nearly to the dirt floor. Nalia stood at the doorway, breath caught in her chest, her heart torn between rage and something she could not yet name. The man she had once thought broken now spoke with a voice that trembled in the small room. "I am not Kato," he whispered. "Not only, I am Dokun Adeyemi, and I beg you, do not leave me." The words struck her like stones. They carried truth, but also desperation. She gripped the doorframe, her knuckles white. Her throat ached with the betrayal still fresh from the square, the sound of his name on other lips, the villagers who had mocked her now bowing to him. He lifted his head, eyes glistening in firelight. "I walked away from that world because it was poisoned. I wanted to be seen for more than wealth, more than power. I wanted love that could not be bought." His voice cracked, the fire popping behind him. Shadows danced across the walls, twisting his figure, making him look both like a penitent and like a stranger. She turned from him, her arms tightening across her chest. Her heart throbbed. "You left me to believe you were nothing. You let them call me wife of the mute. You let me drown in their laughter. I chose silence," he said, forcing the words out as though each was heavy. "I chose the mat on the ground. I chose to show you I could not buy you, that I could only wait, hoping you would see me." Her breath shuddered, her eyes brimming. She wanted to scream, to break something, to claw the truth out of him until nothing was left hidden. Yet the memory of his hand clutching hers through the fever, of his voice in the market square, pressed against her anger. She stepped deeper inside, the door closing behind her. "An Amira?" she whispered. The silence returned, crushing. He bowed his head, his voice hollow. "A life I lost, a name I carry still. But you are not her. You are not a shadow of the past. You are here, in flesh, in fire. And I beg you, see me as I am now, not who I was. The air thickened. Her tears spilled freely, but they were not only grief. They were confusion, longing, fury, hope, all tangled. Then came another sound at the door. Her father, Bakari. His figure loomed, his tone gruff. "Daughter, the man you wed is rich. Use this. Ask him for help. The debts grow again. You can save us." The words slashed through her like a blade. The very chains she thought she had broken now returned, her father's eyes not seeing her as a woman, but as coin. She straightened, her body trembling, her voice low but sharp. "I am not a bargaining chip, not your salvation, not for sale." Bakari stiffened, his face twisting with disbelief. He opened his mouth to argue, but her gaze cut him down. For the first time, she stood not as the obedient daughter, but as her own voice. He muttered, cursed under his breath, and retreated into the night. The door closed with a thud that shook her bones. She turned back toward Dokun. He was still on his knees, tears on his cheeks, his hands open, waiting. She approached slowly, each step heavy as stone. Her hand rose, trembling, and rested on his shoulder. He looked up, hope flickering in his eyes, raw and unguarded. Her voice broke, but her words held steady. "If I stay, it will be by choice. We will wed again, not in shadows, not in chains. My mother will sit in honor, and I will stand as a free woman, not sold, not bought." The fire crackled, sparks leaping upward as if the world itself answered. He nodded, his lips parting but no words coming. His silence was no longer emptiness. It was promise. She lowered herself to his level, her face inches from his. Her tears fell onto his skin, mixing with his own. "I choose to stay," she whispered, her hand pressed firmer against him, anchoring him in this moment. The fire roared, shadows collapsing and rising again, the room pulsing with a new rhythm, one born of pain, of truth, of fragile hope. And yet, as the night deepened, the question remained unspoken in both their hearts. Could love truly rise from the ashes of lies, or would the past return to claim them again? The village square had changed. Where once the air had been thick with jeers, now it swelled with song and hammer blows. Dust rose beneath the feet of children carrying bricks, and the clang of iron tools echoed against the walls of new structures. A school stood half-finished, its walls rising straight from the soil. Beside it, the frame of a well shimmered with fresh rope. Piles of books, wrapped in cloth, waited on mats. The villagers who once turned their backs now bent low with gratitude, their eyes following every step of the couple who had returned, not with gold for themselves, but with gifts for the many. Nalia moved among them with sleeves rolled, her face damp with sweat and sun. She guided children to stack wood, handed herbs to elders, showed mothers where to lay mats for shade. She wore no jewels, only the same simple fabrics she had always known, though her hands no longer trembled. She carried herself as though the earth beneath her feet belonged to her, not by ownership, but by right of having endured. Kato, Dokun, walked close by, his frame tall against the rising sun. He gave instructions with measured words, no longer hoarding silence, no longer afraid of his own voice. Villagers who once spat his name now nodded eagerly, fetching water, laying stone, asking what else they could do. Respect hung in the air like incense, a sharp reversal of scorn, yet the memory of their cruelty lingered in every hammer strike. Nalia did not forget. She accepted their bowed heads, but did not crave them. When one woman knelt before her, pressing her forehead to the dust, Nalia reached down, lifted her gently, and said only, "Stand. Use your hands to build, not to bow." As the sun dipped lower, the smell of roasted maize drifted from nearby fires. The day's work slowed. Villagers gathered with weary but proud faces, children running among them with laughter. The school's skeleton loomed tall, its shadow stretching long. The well's rope glistened, wet with the first clean water pulled from its depths. The taste of it lingered sweet and cool on every tongue. That night, under lamplight, Nalia carried something wrapped in cloth. She stepped into the classroom walls that still smelled of raw clay. She knelt in the center, unwrapped the bundle. Inside lay the old mat, the frayed, torn piece of fabric that had once separated her from the man she thought was mute and unworthy. She spread it flat on the ground, pressing its edges with her palms, her face steady. "This stays here," she said softly, though only the walls listened. So every child who learns within these walls will know what it means to rise from dust. The mat lay like a relic, no longer of shame, but of witness. At dawn, she carried a sack of grain through narrow paths to the farthest hut. Her father stood at the door, his frame thinner, his hair grayer. He looked at her with eyes that flickered between pride and regret. His mouth opened, but no words formed. He did not ask forgiveness. She did not offer it. She only set the sack at his threshold, her hands brushing dust from her skirt. She turned to go, her steps even, her shoulders squared. He called her name once, voice breaking, but she did not look back. The twist of the day came not from villagers or elders, but from within her own chest. She realized forgiveness was not the same as return. She could leave bread at his door, but not her soul. Compassion, without chains. It was the sharpest freedom she had ever tasted. Seasons turned. Harvests ripened. Children's laughter rose from the school walls, their voices reciting lessons that cracked the silence of generations. The well brimmed with water that carried no shame. Villagers told stories at night of the woman who had been sold yet stood unbent, of the man who had once been mute, yet rose with a voice strong enough to rebuild. One evening, as fields blushed gold beneath the setting sun, Nalia walked among the corn. The leaves brushed her arms, whispering in the breeze. She stopped, closed her eyes, let the wind lift her scarf until it fluttered like wings. The air smelled of soil, clean and alive. Nothing like the incense of her wedding day that had once choked her. Behind her, Dokun approached, his smile quiet, his hands calloused from labor he could have paid others to do. He did not carry jewels, nor did he wear the suit she had seen in that photograph. He carried only the dust of the fields on his skin, the weight of books under his arm, and the softness of a man who had laid his pride down and built something better from it. He stepped beside her. They did not speak. They did not need to. Their silence no longer cut. It healed. The corn swayed, bending in rhythm with the wind. The school bell, small and cracked, rang in the distance as children tested it, its sound carrying through the fields like laughter carried by the earth itself. Nalia looked up at the sky, painted with fire and fading light. She breathed deeply, and for the first time the air did not weigh heavy. She had been dragged to an altar as if to a grave. Now she stood in harvest fields, alive, free, her roots deep in soil that had once threatened to bury her. The scarf flew higher, and she let it, her lips curving into a smile that held both sorrow and triumph. But even as her heart swelled with peace, one question remained, fragile and dangerous. Would this fragile garden of hope withstand the storms yet to come, or was this only the calm before another reckoning? The wind carried the question into the darkening horizon, and she held his hand tightly, ready to face whatever came next. Sometimes life leads us through the harshest roads before we can touch the gentlest light. What begins as loss, shame, or silence may, with time, become the very soil where dignity and compassion take root. Pain is never meaningless when it teaches the heart how to stand, how to forgive without surrender, and how to give without becoming chained. Every struggle we endure, every wound we carry, has the power to shape a deeper strength. The journey through betrayal, loneliness, or fear is not meant to break us, but to reveal what cannot be broken. Like clay hardened by fire, the human spirit endures trial after trial, only to emerge with a form that is stronger, more beautiful, and more lasting than before. There is a truth whispered by the earth and echoed by every generation. We are not defined by the cruelty done to us, but by the grace we choose to offer in return. To answer hatred with bitterness is easy. To rise above it, to live with compassion and resolve, is the victory that endures. The measure of a life is not in wealth, not in titles, not even in the applause of a crowd, but in the quiet courage to stand with dignity and to sow seeds of kindness in soil that once seemed barren. Forgiveness, too, is not about forgetting or excusing. It is about releasing oneself from the grip of bitterness, choosing to walk forward with open hands instead of clenched fists. To forgive is not to return to chains, but to break them completely. And when love or mercy is offered freely, without condition, it becomes a power greater than any cruelty, greater than any wound. The lessons are simple, yet profound, that the human spirit can transform shame into strength, silence into voice, and sorrow into seeds of renewal. What we build out of our suffering, whether hope, compassion, or resilience, becomes a legacy far greater than any wealth. And in the end, it is not what was taken from us that tells our story, but what we gave back, even when we had little left to give. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. If its echoes have touched something within you, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments, to join in reflection, and to let your voice be part of the conversation. Don't forget to follow and subscribe to the channel, so together we can continue to explore tales that remind us of the strength of the human heart and the light that can be found even in the darkest places.